The president of France set to arrive at Andrews Air Force Base for a state visit with President Obama. The two leaders will be sharing some quality time together after sharing an op-ed in today's Washington Post outlining their common points of interest. But critics are wondering if the U.S. is becoming, well, too much like France. Simon Rosenberg, guess what? He's back. Filling in for Juan Williams, who's in traffic. And Simon, of course, the president and founder of the New Democrat Network. Thanks for stepping in. Howard Kurtz is the host of Media Buzz. Steve Hayes is a senior writer for the Weekly Standard and a Fox News contributor. And they make up my panel in D.C. today. All right. Howard, let me ask you about this. So we have Hollande and Obama together. And people are saying, wow, you know, I remember just 10 years ago when we were talking about freedom fries, and America didn't really like France all that much. Are these two guys really that similar, and is there anything for Americans to be worried about?
The U.S. is nothing like France. Our baguettes and pastries are far inferior. And our president didn't just leave his first lady for an actress who he was visiting while wearing a motorcycle helmet. So there are certainly cultural differences between the two countries. And as far as the economics, even though a lot of discouraged workers now no longer showing up in the unemployment rolls, our rate is down to 6.6%. France has a bigger jobless problem. And this president, Obama, while he certainly has tried to add to the social safety net, is not an actual socialist like Francois Hollande.
Well, yeah, but Steve, you know, so Hollande is a socialist.
Right.
So I think that's why some Americans are looking at this skeptically. And you mentioned the 8% unemployment rate. That's been in France for 30 years. And we're talking about health care now, Obamacare. Do you see any similarities between France and America?
Yeah, I think there's no question that America is at least moving in that direction. I think Howie's right that we're not there. I mean, it's not the same if you take a snapshot right now. But there's no question when you look at the growth of government, particularly in the last 5 years, that this president has moved us more towards a model that would be like the French model. And look, this isn't just, you know, conservatives who are making this claim. There's a very interesting essay in the current issue of Foreign Affairs that talks about America's social democratic future. Wow. And suggests that America is, in fact, moving to a future that looks a lot more like the Western social democracies of Europe.
You know, I'm thinking back, Simon, when President Bush was getting together with Western leaders in Europe, it was maybe Angela Merkel, you know, in Germany that he might have been spending time with. Is there anything to read into this sort of a meeting, or would a Republican president also be hosting this type of meeting?
No, I think this is in part a reward because France has been playing ball on some of the foreign policy initiatives of President Obama, and during what has been a tough period of international negotiation, they've actually been a very constructive force in these international negotiations. So I think there's a little bit of a pat on the head for Hollande. And I think, look, I think this argument that we're becoming like France is ridiculous. I mean, we have the most, there's no nation in the world that wouldn't trade their position with the United States now. We are the most dynamic companies in the world. We're leading in virtually every area of technology. Our unemployment rates come down 3.6% in the last few years. And I think people got to calm down a little bit on this comparison to this sclerotic European economy.
Except for this next topic, which is this. Vice President Joe Biden trying to put a positive spin on the latest report that Obamacare will lead to the loss of millions of jobs. Here's what he said to Time magazine, quote, well, you've got a whole baby boomer generation that were hanging on to jobs, not moving because either they were tied down because their mortgage was underwater or they couldn't leave because they had health care. This frees people up, and there is zero evidence that this is costing people jobs now. So, Howie, a lot of people, in conjunction with looking at France and the United States and now Obamacare and the CBO report that came out, and now you have Joe Biden saying zero evidence that it's costing jobs. I think some people are seeing similarities to a socialist nation in the sense that are we now bringing about another welfare kind of state with people choosing to stay at home instead of going to work?
Well, it's better than the comparisons a year ago about is the U.S. becoming more like Greece and then threatening to default because we have gotten the deficit down. But this Joe Biden interview with Time magazine is as much about preserving at least the appearance that he could run for president as anything else. He is delivering the administration spin here about zero evidence of any job loss. Now, I do think some on the right overstated the CBO report to say 2.5 million jobs will be eliminated, but actually people are going to choose to opt out of the workforce, and therefore the equivalent could be lost. But at the same time, I think the notion that people are being liberated from job lock is a very positive way of dealing with something that's going to impact the economy.
But Steve, people maybe are not being laid off as a result of Obamacare, but there is evidence out there that companies are not hiring because of Obamacare.
Well, sure, and in some cases people are being laid off as a result of Obamacare. He can say that there's no evidence, but we've seen lots of anecdotal evidence. Now, it may be evidence that he doesn't want to see or doesn't want to acknowledge, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, and he can't pick and choose what evidence actually exists or not. There's also been polling, at least a couple of different polls, including a Gallup poll last summer, that found that nearly half of American companies said that they would be either freezing hiring,
right,
and one out of 5 companies said they'd already reduced their employment. So there is evidence that in fact there are going to be fewer people working. And I do think, look, you may not like the idea that this is an argument that socialists have made in Europe, but socialists have made the argument in Europe that you know, we're all working too hard. We shouldn't be doing that. It's the same argument that we're hearing now.
Isn't that what made American different, Simon? Well, I mean, in Europe they take a lot of vacations, much more than America. They work shorter hours. Isn't that what made America different?
But nothing that this is happening here is going to change all that. I mean, look what's happened since Obamacare kicked in, right? We had the highest quarterly GDP rating that we had in 5 years, and the unemployment rate is coming down at a faster rate than it has in years. At the same time, Obamacare is being enacted. So if this was such a job killer, why are we having such good numbers coming out of? And by the way, the deficits are plummeting.
But that's not including numbers.
Force participation rate is
no, you
dropping.
can't have it both ways. You can't have it both ways. No, you can't. No. By the way, that's not entirely true. It's also coming down.
The major reason for the reduction in the rate is the labor force participation rate.
It's also because there are fewer jobs being destroyed now in the American economy because we have a very dynamic economy. New jobs are created.
And this is why we have a totally different point of view depending on who you ask with regard to Obamacare, jobs, and so much more. Guys, I got to wrap it up, but thanks so much for your time.